I've got a shape layer on the base that I applied a gradient to, which I'll show you in a minute. I've got this coronavirus graphic here that is on a path, and I created a path for it to move from one place to the other. So as I grab in the middle of this graphic, I grab the actual graphic itself. You're seeing it's bending this path. So now the graphic goes like that instead of just straight across. But I'll walk you through each one of these real quickly. Because one of the questions that came up is just, how do you make things appear and disappear? And one of the things that's, I think, when you're beginning in After Effects or when you're first putting things in, that's really confounding is the fact that as you type something, so if I type in the word infographic, the fact that it shows up across the entire timeline, so it spans the entire time that we have indicated for this video. Shorten this a little bit so you can see it. And so it's not incredibly intuitive that you can grab the edge of these and you can drag in from both ends and shorten that element for when it's on screen. So that's one really basic element. So that, that makes it appear where it happens in the timeline, and as soon as it gets beyond that red band, it disappears. Okay, next is movement. So with all of these things, if you have not been in After Effects, and there's several of you that have not posted anything yet, so I'm assuming you've not been in After Effects yet. All of the movement happens, well, a lot of the transformations or the things that you can make it do happen revealed within that posted piece in the timeline. It's under transform here. So opacity, if I click on top of any of these blue numbers, then click and hold, I can run them up and down. I don't have to just double click and type in there. I can use it like a slider. So just by selecting opacity and running that down to 36%, it's at 36% the whole time it's on screen, unless I set a keyframe. And the way you set a keyframe, there are these little rings that are next to each one of these elements. As soon as I click in the center of that ring, I get an indicator here and an indicator here that I have set a keyframe, and I've told it that at that point it's going to be 36% opacity. If I slide my slider over to the right and I click over here now to set another keyframe, I can run that opacity up. So now as I go back over the top and I slide, it's going from that 36% up to that 100%. So that's just opacity. If I go back to the beginning and I get my move tool and I grab that graphic, drag it off of the visible area, and then set a keyframe. Now I've anchored it there and said that's where I want it to start when it comes on screen. I can drag to the end here, and I'm going to now pull this graphic. I'm just going to, as I start to pull, I'm going to hold down Shift so that it comes off the other, it goes straight across, and you can see it is automatically, as I started to drag it, created that other keyframe. So as I pull my playhead across here, that graphic is now following that path that I set for it to go. Now, earlier, if I've got this right here, and I'm in the center of that movement from left to right, and now I have my move tool, and I drag here in the middle, I'm getting a little bit of an arc happening in there. I can also control that arc by moving these handles, just like in Illustrator. So now as I go back to my playhead, that type is following that arc that I manipulated just by moving that type right in the middle of its play from left to right. All right, let's take it here, and I'm going to go to scale now. I'm going to set an anchor point. Let's bring my playhead back here. And I'm going to set an anchor point right there at 100%. And then I'm going to go to the top of that arc, and I'm going to run my scale percentage larger. Of course, my anchor is here, so it's going off the page. So I'm also going to bring it down in here, which is going to change my trajectory path of that movement. And then when I get back to the end, I'm going to scale it. This time I'm just going to type in 100% and scale it back to 100%. So as we run back here, it comes in from the left. It starts to grow, following that path, jumps off the screen, and starts to shrink back down as it ends back up in there. So you have a lot of control. It may not seem like you have a lot of control, but you do have a lot of control over what it's doing. You know, we could rotate it just as easily by putting a keyframe in 2 different spots. And you can see all these keyframes visible over here. Now, one of the things that I can do is, as I still have this infographic selected, I can move these keyframes. It's going to change when that actual transition happens. So there I slid the scale one over to the right a little bit, so it got bigger a little bit later in its arc. Opacity, I could drag all the way out to the end here. So it's not going to get to that 100% till it's actually coming right back in toward the end of its trajectory. Everything you put out onto this page, layers here work just like they do in Illustrator and Photoshop. So I can drag a layer down, it's going to disappear because it's underneath that shaped layer. Any one of these elements that once you've placed it in your timeline, you can manipulate these things in a lot of the same ways that you do in Photoshop. So an example is I'm going to click on this coronavirus graphic, and you can see it's highlighted down here, layer 5, in that coronavirus graphic .psd. And now I'm going to right click on it. I can change the blending mode, and this is just like you can do with layers in Photoshop. I can tell it to multiply with the background. So now all the pixels from that original graphic are multiplying with that red background that's back there. I can go back and change it to any one of these. So it's just changing based on color. Something a little more dramatic. So there's vivid light. So now it's this real kind of electric red. I can also click on it and I can give it a style. So if I wanted to have a gradient overlay, that overlay is not blending right now with it, so it's just showing that black to gray. And I could come in, every time I apply something else to it, it's going to show this gradient overlay. I'm going to reveal it down here in my timeline settings. And I can click on here where it says edit gradient, and I can change these colors. So I'm going to change that to, let's do something dramatic like blue. We'll go blue to black. And you see that that has changed. And the blend mode here is normal. So now I'm going to tell it, change it based on color. So now that I turn it off, there's the bright red one we had. As soon as I turn it on, it is affecting that right over the top of that image. So as it comes in, it's that blue all the way across. So it's very similar to things that you can do in Photoshop and Illustrator. And I'll go through a little bit more of those on Thursday recorded. Once you have things placed out here on your timeline, also drag them around in terms of where they're going to show up and when they're going to show up within the timeline. So if you want this text to come in first, drag it earlier in the timeline. anything that overlaps, that means those things are going to be on screen at the same time. So those two elements are overlapping, and then that one comes in at the end. This the shape layer is going to stay the whole time. Now the shape layer is just a rectangle that I drew in. So I'm going to delete that for a second, and I'm going to come up here under my rectangle tool. I could do rectangle, or I could choose ellipse or rounded let's do a rounded rectangle tool. So I can come in here and grab that edge, and I'm going to go to the information about that rectangle. Up here. So reveal rectangle, and transform it. I'll open that. I'll open fill. Let's see in the roundness. I wanted to change the radius of the edges. Let's see. There we go. Rectangle path. So as I run this up, I'm actually adding more roundness to that rectangle. It's filled with red because the fill up here says red. So I could click this, I could take it to any color in this picker and change it. I'm going to close some of these down. I'm just going to go to transform now, and I'm going to go to opacity, and I'm going to make that opacity, let's say 33%. All right, I'm going to come back to my final. And if I pull this back over here, I deleted that red one. So now, because the blue is on top, it's affecting everything that's beneath it. So as these things run underneath this blue band, you can see that it's affecting that, it's changing that color as it comes in. So between there to right there, you can see that that color difference is happening.